The HOA Karen called the cops when I returned to check my own yacht, but what they found was way worse than trespassing. I pulled up to my dock after 3 months away and saw the flashing blue and red lights. Then she stepped out of my boat's cabin, the HOA president, wearing a robe, holding a coffee mug like she lived there. She told the police, I was the one breaking the law on the boat my late wife and I built together. A boat that holds my wife's ashes. She even had fake papers giving her custody of my property. But what that power-tripping Karen didn't know is that while she was getting comfortable, she left a little clue behind that was about to bring her entire crooked kingdom crashing down. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment, because this story is a wild ride. And if you believe no homeowner should ever have their sacred memories invaded by a power-tripping HOA, smash that subscribe button, because you are going to love watching this empire crumble. The drive back from my daughter's place in Arizona is a long one, but that last hour through Michigan, when the bare trees start to look familiar, always feels like coming home. 3 months is a long time to be away. The longest I've been gone since Maggie passed. After I'd unpacked the truck and let the quiet of the house settle around me, I did what I always do. I grabbed the old canvas bag with my cleaning supplies and headed for the marina. The air still had that sharp, late winter bite to it, the kind that promises spring is just around the corner. The lake was still, a dark sheet of glass reflecting the gray sky. My boat, the Maggie D, was my one constant. I'd visit her once a month, sometimes more, just to run the systems, check the lines, and sit in the cabin where Maggie and I had spent the best years of our lives. It wasn't just a boat. It was a memory vault. The only place I still truly felt her. Her ashes were sealed in a small urn, right beneath the mast. She was the soul of that boat, and I was its keeper. I turned the final corner onto the marina access road, and my stomach dropped. Flashing lights, red and blue, pulsing against the tree line. A sheriff's cruiser was parked right at the head of my dock, B-dock, slip 12. My slip. My first thought was that there'd been a break-in, maybe some kids messing around with the boats during the off-season. It happened. I pulled my truck up behind the cruiser, parked, and got out, feeling that cold knot of worry tighten in my gut. A deputy, young enough to be my grandson, got out of his car and held up a hand. He looked uncomfortable, like he'd rather be anywhere else. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stay back. This is an active situation. I held up my keys. This is my slip, B12. That's my boat, the Maggie D. I'm Frank Delaney. What's going on? The deputy glanced down at a clipboard, then back at me. His expression didn't soften. We received a call about an unauthorized individual attempting to access a vessel under HOA custodianship. I just stared at him. It felt like he was speaking a different language. HOA custodianship? Son, I own that boat. Bought and paid for 30 years ago. I've got the title in my glove box. That's when the cabin door of my boat slid open. Not with the familiar creak I knew so well, but smoothly, quietly, and out stepped Karen Schulman, the new HOA president. She wasn't wearing a jacket against the cold. She was wearing a plush white bathrobe, the kind you get at a fancy hotel. In one hand, she held a steaming coffee mug with the HOA's tacky logo on it. She looked at me, then at the deputy, and a small, satisfied smirk played on her lips. It was a look of pure, unadulterated power. Officer, this is the man I was telling you about, she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet concern. He seems to think he has some claim to this property. We've had to deal with his presence before. I couldn't process it. My brain was trying to connect the dots. Karen Schulman, in a bathrobe, coming out of my boat. The boat where my wife's ashes were. The police. The words, unauthorized individual. It was like watching a movie about someone else's life. Karen, what in God's name are you doing on my boat? My voice came out lower, rougher than I intended. She took a delicate sip from her mug. It's not your boat anymore, Frank. It's an abandoned vessel, and it has been placed under the temporary protection of the Homeowners Association due to safety violations. She said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, as if she were reading from a script. I felt a surge of cold fire rush through my veins. But years in the Navy taught me one thing. You don't show a hot temper. You get cold. You get methodical. I walked to my truck, opened the glove box, and pulled out the thick plastic envelope that held the boat's registration, the title, and my insurance card. I walked back to the deputy and handed them to him. This boat is registered to me, Frank Delaney. It's been moored in this slip, which I pay for 17 years. I just got back from visiting my daughter. It is not abandoned. The deputy took the papers and looked them over. He seemed to relax a little, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He looked from the official documents in his hand to Karen, who was still standing there in her robe like the Queen of Sheba. "Ma'am," the officer started, "these documents seem to be in order." Karen didn't even flinch. She just smiled that icy smile again. "Of course they are, but they are outdated." She disappeared back into the cabin for a moment and came back holding a sheaf of papers in a crisp manila folder. "This is the emergency resolution passed by the HOA board 6 weeks ago. The vessel was found to have a significant fuel leak, constituting an environmental hazard. Under Bylaw 17, Section C, the board has the authority to take temporary custodianship of any property that poses a direct threat to the community. The boat is, for all legal purposes, in our care until the issue is remediated. Mr. Delaney has abandoned his responsibility. I knew for a fact there was no fuel leak. I'd serviced the lines myself before I left. It was a lie, a clean and simple lie, but it was printed on official-looking letterhead." The deputy read through her papers, and I could see the change in his face. The sympathy was gone, replaced by resignation. It was one person's word, backed by paperwork, against another's. He handed me back my registration. "Mr. Delaney, I'm sorry, but this looks like a civil matter. I can't determine ownership here. All I know is the HOA has filed paperwork claiming they have a right to be here. I can't force them to leave." He paused, and then delivered the final blow. "In fact, since they are the current legal custodians according to this document, I have to ask you to leave the premises. If you don't, they can press charges for trespassing." The world went silent for a moment. All I could hear was the gentle lapping of the water against the hull of my boat. The boat Karen Schulman was living in. She had stolen it. She had stolen my home away from home, the last piece of Maggie I had left in the world. And she had done it with a piece of paper and a lie. I was being ordered off my own property, treated like a criminal by a woman who had moved into my life and was now drinking coffee in my wife's galley. The deputy looked at me, waiting. Karen stood there, a smug victor, waiting for me to make a scene, to yell, to give her more ammunition. I just gave a slow, deliberate nod. I turned my back on them, on my boat, and walked to my truck. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I saw her in my rearview mirror, standing on the deck, watching me go. They had taken my boat. But what they didn't understand, what Karen in her robe couldn't possibly comprehend, was that they hadn't just taken a vessel. They had stolen a memory. They had declared war on a dead woman's husband. And they had just given a retired Navy mechanic a final mission. That night, sleep didn't come. I just sat in my armchair, the one Maggie always said I'd become a part of, and stared out the window into the darkness. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen Schulman's smirk. I kept replaying it, trying to understand how we got here. It wasn't a hostile community. We were mostly retirees, a mix of folks who'd worked in the auto plants, some teachers, a few vets like me, quiet. The biggest drama we'd had in the last 10 years was a debate over what color to paint the community mailbox. Then, last fall, Karen got herself elected HOA president. It wasn't a landslide victory. It was a sneak attack. The vote was held during the annual meeting, which hardly anyone ever attended. But Karen had spent weeks collecting proxy votes, bits of paper giving her the right to vote on someone else's behalf. She'd gone door to door, mostly to the newer residents who didn't know any better, with some story about needing votes to approve a new petunia budget for the front gate. People signed just to get her off their porch. She walked into that meeting with enough proxy votes in her purse to elect herself president for life. And almost immediately, the notices started appearing. My next-door neighbor Jim, a guy who fought in Vietnam, got a fine for $500 because of excessive paint degradation on his window trim, peeling paint. Another neighbor, a widow down the street, was ordered to remove a small, handmade memorial she'd put in her garden for her husband, a fallen Marine. Karen's letter called it an unapproved lawn fixture. It was a power trip of the highest order, but nobody wanted to fight. It was easier to just pay the fine or take the memorial down. It was easier to stay quiet. The next morning, I dug out my copy of the HOA covenants and bylaws. I sat at my kitchen table with a hot coffee and read every single page, line by line. I've rewired engine rooms on destroyers. 100 pages of rules didn't scare me. And just as I suspected, there was nothing. Not a word about seizing boats, taking custody, or environmental hazards. It wasn't there. But then I found the minutes from the last special meeting, which had been tucked into the back of the latest newsletter. The meeting was held at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, a month after I'd left for Arizona. The attendance record showed only 5 people were there: Karen, her 2 cronies on the board, and 2 other residents who I'm sure just wandered in by mistake. And there it was, an addendum to Bylaw 17. A new clause, hastily written and full of vague language, giving the board emergency authority to secure and remediate any private property, including watercraft, deemed a potential community liability. It was a blank check, and Karen had written it to herself. My first call was to the marina manager, a guy who'd been there for years. He sounded nervous. "Frank, I'm sorry. My hands are tied," he said, his voice low. Karen and the board came down with their paperwork, said there was a fuel leak. They told me if I didn't give them the keys to the slip's utility box, they'd have my contract terminated. I got a family, Frank. I didn't blame him. He was just a man trying to keep his job. I knew then that talking to the pawns was pointless. I had to go straight to the Queen. The next monthly board meeting was that Thursday. I didn't go in hot. I went in prepared. I had a folder with my boat's title, my registration, my insurance policy, and 16 years of receipts for my slip fees. I also had the maintenance log for the Maggie D, showing the date I'd inspected the fuel lines myself, just 2 days before I left town. I walked into the community clubhouse, and the air went still. Karen was sitting at the head of a long table, flanked by her 2 loyalists. She saw my folder, and her eyes narrowed. I waited my turn. When they opened the floor to resident concerns, I stood up, walked to the table, and calmly laid everything out. I didn't raise my voice. I just stated the facts. "There is no fuel leak," I said, looking directly at her. "My boat is not abandoned. You had no legal right to board my vessel, let alone take possession of it. I am here tonight to ask for the immediate return of my property and the removal of any false claims filed against it." The room was dead silent. Karen let me finish. She looked at my pristine paperwork, then she looked at me. She didn't look angry. She looked bored, like I was a fly she was about to swat. She picked up a single piece of paper from a stack next to her and slid it across the table toward me. "As a matter of fact, Frank, we're glad you came. This is for you." It was an invoice. An invoice addressed to me, from the HOA. The total at the bottom was for $1,200. The line item read, "Emergency contamination cleanup and vessel securing fee." My blood ran cold. "You're charging me for a cleanup of a leak that never happened?" Karen leaned forward, a predatory glint in her eyes. "And for your behavior this evening, which I consider threatening to the board, your access to the marina is hereby suspended indefinitely. You are banned." If you are seen on the docks again, we will have you arrested for trespassing. Are there any other resident concerns?" I was dismissed, just like that. She had used my own boat to invent a debt, and then used my attempt to seek justice as an excuse to ban me entirely. I stood there for a moment, the invoice shaking slightly in my hand. In that instant, everything became crystal clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake that could be fixed with logic and paperwork. This was a hijacking. This was theft, plain and simple, dressed up in the cheap suit of HOA authority. I turned and walked out of the meeting, without another word. Back home, I stood in my empty driveway, the cold seeping through my jacket. Across the frozen, quiet lake, I could just make out the silhouette of the Maggie D against the darkening sky. A single light was on in her cabin, my boat, my home, my wife's resting place, and a stranger was living inside. They had declared war. They just didn't know I'd fight back. The next morning, it was official. A brand new chain-link gate stood at the entrance to the marina access road, a big, ugly scar on the landscape. And on the gate was a gleaming silver keypad lock, the kind that looks like it belongs on a bank vault. Karen wasn't just banning me with words anymore. She was blocking me with steel. I was physically locked out. It was a petty move, but it was an effective one. My boat was less than 200 yards from my house, but it might as well have been on the other side of the moon. I couldn't get to it, and that was that. But a community like this is a small place. People talk. The whispers started almost immediately. Jim, my neighbor with the peeling paint, saw me out checking my mail and wandered over, his hands deep in his pockets. He looked around before he spoke, like he was worried Karen had listening devices planted in the rose bushes. "Frank," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "people are seeing things." My boy saw Karen's son, that punk kid of hers, taking a bunch of his friends down to the docks the other night. Said it looked like they were having a party. My blood ran cold. The image of a bunch of disrespectful kids on Maggie's boat, drinking beer, leaving a mess, it was a violation on a level I couldn't even put into words. "He see what boat they were on?" I asked, my voice tight. Jim nodded grimly. "The Maggie D. He saw the name plain as day. Said there were cans all over the deck the next morning." The story spread, like a slow-moving virus through the neighborhood. Some people just shrugged. They were the ones who didn't want to get involved, who were afraid of getting a fine for their grass being half an inch too long. They'd seen what Karen could do, and they decided the path of least resistance was to just keep their heads down and pay their dues. But others were angry. They'd stop me in the grocery store or when I was out for a walk, their faces tight with quiet rage. They all said the same thing. "It isn't right, Frank. But what can you do? She's got the whole board in her pocket. It feels like there's nothing we can do." They were good people, but they felt powerless. Karen had created a system where the cost of fighting back seemed higher than the cost of just putting up with the abuse. She was counting on that. She was counting on us all to just roll over. That's when I knew I couldn't fight her on her turf. The HOA meetings, the bylaws she wrote herself, that was her kingdom. I had to go somewhere else. I had to find a higher authority. I drove down to the county records office the next day. It was one of those old brick buildings that smelled like dusty paper and weak coffee. I stood in line, waited my turn, and walked up to a clerk who looked like she'd been sitting behind that same piece of plexiglass since the dawn of time. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, without emotion, just the facts. My property had been seized by a private organization under false pretenses. I told her I wanted to file a formal grievance. She pushed a stack of forms toward me. Form 7B, Complaint Against a Non-Governmental Governing Body. It was a mountain of paperwork. But I'm a man who spent his life reading technical manuals. I sat in one of the hard plastic chairs and filled out every single line, every box, every attachment. I detailed the illegal seizure, the fabricated environmental hazard, and the fraudulent invoice. I attached copies of my title, my registration, and the minutes from Karen's special meeting. It took me 2 hours. When I was done, I handed the stack back to the clerk. She stamped every page with a heavy, satisfying thud, gave me a carbon copy, and said, "You'll be notified by mail of any proceedings. Could take a few months." A few months. It felt like an eternity. But as I walked out of that building and into the cold afternoon sun, I felt a small click inside me. It wasn't a win, not yet, but it was a start. I had officially put the county on notice. My story was no longer just a rumor, whispered between neighbors. It was a public record. A seed had been planted. That night, I sat up late again, staring out at the lake. The formal complaint was a good move, a necessary move, but it was slow. It was bureaucracy, fighting bureaucracy. I needed something faster, something harder. I needed undeniable proof that Karen was lying. Arguing with her was like trying to nail jello to a wall. I needed evidence so solid that not even she could twist it. And then, a name popped into my head. Mike Skelly. We called him Skip. We served together on the Forrestal. He was the best diagnostic engineer I ever knew. He could listen to a V8 engine and tell you which piston was misfiring. After the Navy, he'd made a career as a marine surveyor, the guy insurance companies and buyers hire to find out what's really going on with a boat, to find the rot hidden under a fresh coat of paint. He was retired now, mostly, but I knew he still took on the odd job if it sounded interesting. I picked up the phone. He answered on the second ring, his voice the same gravelly baritone it had been 40 years ago. "Skelly." I didn't waste time with small talk. "Skip, it's Frank Delaney." There was a pause, then a warm chuckle. "Frankie boy, don't tell me you finally sunk that old tub of yours." I explained everything. The fake fuel leak, Karen living in the boat, the invoice, the keypad on the gate. I laid it all out. When I was done, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I thought maybe he was going to tell me I was crazy. Instead, he just said, "That woman's cruising for a bruising. When do you want to do the inspection?" A wave of relief washed over me so powerful, it almost knocked the wind out of me. I wasn't alone in this anymore. "There's a problem, Skip. She's got me banned from the marina. The gate is locked." I could almost hear him smiling through the phone. "Frankie," he said, his voice full of dry humor. "Since when does a lock stop a Navy man?" He was right. A plan began to form, a clear, straight line through the fog of my anger. We weren't going to ask for permission. We were going to conduct a surprise inspection. 2 days later, at 5 in the morning, the world was still dark and silent, blanketed in that pre-dawn Michigan chill. Skip pulled up to my house in a beat-up Ford Ranger, the cab smelling faintly of motor oil and stale coffee. He was exactly as I remembered him. Sharp eyes, a no-nonsense handshake, and a leather tool bag that looked like it had seen a few wars. We didn't need to break any locks. I'd made one quiet phone call. Jim, my neighbor, the one who'd gotten the paint fine, had the gate code. His son mowed the marina grass in the summer. He met us at the entrance, a shadow in the darkness. He typed in the 6-digit code, the gate lock clicked open, and he just nodded at me. "Give her hell, Frank," he whispered, and then melted back into the shadows. That's what this was all about. It wasn't just my fight anymore. We drove down the access road with our headlights off, the truck bumping along in the dark. As we rounded the final turn, my heart sank. There it was. My boat, the Maggie D. A warm yellow light glowed from the cabin windows. Someone was inside. Skip killed the engine and we sat there for a moment, just watching. A silhouette passed in front of the window. Karen. It was almost surreal seeing this woman making herself at home in my sanctuary. Skip just grunted. "All right, plan B it is," he said. We wait. We sat in the cold truck for the better part of an hour. Finally, just as the sky began to turn a soft, bruised purple, the cabin light went out. A few minutes later, Karen emerged, now dressed for the day. She locked the cabin, walked briskly up the dock, got into her luxury SUV parked nearby, and drove away, probably off to ruin someone else's morning. The second her car was out of sight, we were moving. I had my own set of keys, of course, and my heart hammered in my chest as I put the key in the lock. It turned smoothly. At least she hadn't changed the locks. The moment I stepped aboard, I knew something was wrong. It didn't feel like my boat anymore. There was a faint, cloying scent of cheap air freshener, trying to cover up something else. A dirty coffee mug with the HOA logo sat on the counter. A woman's coat, not Maggie's, was slung over a chair. This wasn't just a place she was camping out. She was living here. Skip got to work immediately. He was methodical, a master of his craft. He didn't just look, he documented. He pulled out a digital camera and started taking pictures of everything. The dark, sticky stains on the teak deck, where beer had obviously been spilled and left to dry. The new scratches in the varnish on the railing. He moved inside and his face hardened. "Frank, come look at this." She'd ripped out the 2 small solar panels I had installed on the cabin roof to keep the batteries topped off. The wires were just cut, hanging loose. He moved to the helm. "And your navigation system, the wiring's been tampered with. It looks like someone tried to bypass the main fuse panel. For what? I have no idea. It was senseless destruction." While Skip documented the physical damage, I went to check on something personal. A few years back, after a friend had his outboard motor stolen, I installed a small, hardwired GPS tracker, hidden deep in the hull. It was my own little insurance policy. I pulled up the app on my phone. The signal was still live. The log showed the boat hadn't left the slip once in the past 3 months. No joyriding. But then I saw something else. The logs also showed a continuous high electrical draw. Every day, for weeks. Far more than the bilge pump or the cabin lights would use. It was the draw of someone running a space heater, a microwave, a television. It was the power signature of someone living there full time, running my batteries down to nothing. Then, I found the last piece of proof I needed. Tucked away in a galley drawer, next to my old set of charts, was a toothbrush, a tube of toothpaste, and a cheap romance novel with the corner of a page folded down. This wasn't a temporary visit. This was a move-in. We photographed every last item. The coat, the mug, the book. It was all the proof we needed. Karen wasn't just securing an abandoned vessel. She was squatting. By the time we finished, the sun was fully up. We locked the cabin, leaving everything exactly as we'd found it, and headed back to my house. Skip uploaded all the photos to his laptop, writing up a detailed professional report of his findings. "No fuel leak," he said, tapping the keyboard. "None. Not a drop. Fuel lines are sound. Bilge is bone dry. This is fraud, Frank. Pure and simple." I felt a surge of victory, but it was short-lived. That afternoon, the other shoe dropped. A sleek sedan I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A man in a crisp suit got out and handed me an envelope. It was a cease and desist letter from an expensive-looking law firm. Karen had found out. Someone must have seen us. The letter was full of legal threats, accusing me of breaking and entering HOA-guarded property and unlawful tampering. It warned that any further attempts to access my own boat would result in immediate legal action. She was doubling down. I was still reading it when my phone rang. It was my daughter, Sarah. She was crying, her voice choked with panic. "Dad, what did you do?" I got a call from HR. I've been placed on administrative leave." I felt my stomach clench. "What? Why?" Sarah took a shaky breath. "They received an email. From your HOA president. From Karen Schulman. It said there had been a mental health incident involving you at the marina, and that you were exhibiting erratic and threatening behavior. They said they were concerned for my well-being and needed to review the situation. Dad, she went after my job." The world tilted. The boat was one thing. Property is property. But this was different. She had reached across state lines to attack my family, to threaten my daughter's livelihood, to weaponize my love for my family against me. I hung up the phone, the cease and desist letter crinkling in my fist. The rage I'd been holding back, the cold, methodical anger, it all evaporated, replaced by a deep, gut-wrenching pain. She was trying to ruin me, to break me completely. For a moment, sitting there in my quiet house, I almost let her. The fight felt too big, the stakes too high. "She's ruining my family," I whispered to the empty room, "not just my boat." Just then, another piece of mail caught my eye on the hall table, one I hadn't noticed before. It was from my boat insurance company. I tore it open. It was a cancellation notice, effective immediately. Reason cited: significant change in vessel use and reported misuse by an unauthorized third party, she had called them. She had reported her own illegal occupation of my boat as misuse to get my policy canceled. That was the last straw. The pain solidified into something harder, something colder and sharper than anything I had ever felt before. This was no longer just about getting my boat back. This was about tearing down her entire corrupt kingdom, brick by brick. I picked up the phone. I made a call, then another, then 3 more. It was time to flip the whole board over. When Karen went after my daughter, she made a critical mistake. She thought she was isolating me, making me desperate. But what she really did was remind me what I was fighting for. It wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about the principle that you don't mess with a man's family. The next morning, I didn't call a litigator to sue Karen. That's what she would have expected. Lawsuits are slow, messy, and expensive. They play out on paper in courtrooms over months or years. Karen was comfortable with paper. She weaponized it. I needed to fight on a different battlefield. My first call was to a small, local law office run by a guy named David Chen. He wasn't a pit bull. He specialized in property law and contracts, the boring stuff that makes the world go round. I didn't hire him to sue the HOA. I hired him to find out who the HOA answered to. Every organization has a boss, even a runaway HOA. David spent a few days digging through county records, land deeds, and corporate filings, and he found the weak link. He found the one thread that could unravel Karen's whole sweater. It turned out the HOA didn't own the marina. They didn't own the docks, the access road, or the land it was all built on. All of it belonged to a regional water trust, a quasi-governmental entity based 2 counties over. The HOA just had a sublease agreement. They were tenants, nothing more. David also found out that the water trust was tired of the deal. The lease wasn't profitable, and dealing with a petty HOA was a constant headache. They'd been quietly looking for a way out for years. That's when the real plan started to take shape. This wasn't going to be about winning an argument. It was going to be about buying the entire game board. My next calls were to my people. I started with a group of vets I have coffee with once a month down at the diner. Guys who'd spent their lives in service, who understood chain of command and the importance of a solid plan. I laid it all out for them. The boat, the lies, my daughter's job, and the sublease. I told them about the water trust wanting out. Then, I made my pitch. She thinks her power comes from a 3-ring binder full of rules she wrote herself. I said, but her real power comes from that lease. She controls the docks. If we take that away from her, she's just a cranky lady with a clipboard. The idea was simple. We would form a cooperative. We'd pool our resources, get a loan, and make the water trust an offer they couldn't refuse. We wouldn't just ask for the lease, we'd buy it outright. We would become the new owners of the marina. My military credit union, the same one I'd banked with for 50 years, was my next stop. I walked in with a business plan David Chen had helped me draft overnight. It outlined how the marina co-op would be managed, our proposed fee structure, and our plan for long-term maintenance. I wasn't asking for a handout. I was presenting a sound investment. The loan officer, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 30, listened patiently. When I finished, she looked at the plan, then at me. "My dad was in the Navy," she said quietly. "He'd love this." She approved the loan that afternoon. Within a week, we had the funding. David Chen, my lawyer, formally approached the Water Trust on behalf of our newly formed entity, the Lakeside Veterans Marina Cooperative. We didn't try to lowball them. We offered a fair market price to buy the sublease and take over all responsibilities, effective immediately. The trust practically bit his hand off. They were thrilled. The paperwork was signed less than 48 hours later. The following Monday morning was bright and cold. I drove down to the marina. The keypad lock was still on the gate. But this time, I wasn't just a band resident. I was the new landlord. I had a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters in the back of my truck. The sound of the chain snapping was one of the most satisfying sounds I've ever heard. I swung the gate wide open and secured it. It would not be closed again. About 20 minutes later, Karen's SUV came speeding down the access road, kicking up gravel. She slammed on her brakes when she saw me standing there, next to the open gate. She stormed out of her car, her face a mask of crimson rage. "What do you think you're doing? I told you, you are banned. This is destruction of HOA property. I'm calling the police." I just stood there, my hands in my pockets, and waited for her to run out of steam. When she finally paused to take a breath, I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Go ahead and call them, Karen," I said, my voice calm and even. "But you might want to call your lawyer first." The HOA's lease on this marina was terminated as of 8 a.m. this morning. "You're the one who's trespassing now." Her jaw dropped. The color drained from her face. She looked like I had just slapped her. That's not possible," she stammered. I just pointed to a brand new sign we'd installed next to the gate. It read, "Property of the Lakeside Veterans Marina Cooperative. All welcome." She stared at the sign, then back at me. Her little kingdom, the source of all her power, had just been sold out from under her. She started screaming then, a string of threats about lawsuits and injunctions and how she would ruin me. I didn't say another word. I just stood there and let her yell. Because just then, my friends started arriving. One by one, cars and trucks pulled up. The guys from the VFW, Jim from next door, the widow whose memorial had been torn down. They got out of their cars, carrying toolboxes and cleaning supplies. They didn't even look at Karen. They just nodded at me and started walking down the docks toward their boats. A quiet army reclaiming their territory. American flags, which had been banned under Karen's rule as unapproved decorations, started appearing on boats. The sight of her, red-faced and screaming while a dozen good people simply ignored her and went about their business, was perfect. She was irrelevant. She had lost. But I had a feeling she wasn't done fighting just yet. Losing the marina didn't chasten Karen. It made her more vicious. A cornered animal is a dangerous animal. Stripped of her primary source of power, she did what desperate people do. She went nuclear. A few days after our takeover, a reporter from the local news station showed up at my door. Karen had called them, spun a wild story, and painted me as the villain. The headline on that night's broadcast was infuriating. "Disgruntled veteran hijacks community marina in HOA dispute." She told them I had organized a hostile takeover, that I was an extremist who refused to follow community rules, and that my actions had put the entire neighborhood at risk. She played the victim perfectly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while talking about her dedication to maintaining property values and community safety. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Next, she tried to get me thrown out of the neighborhood entirely. She called an emergency board meeting with a single item on the agenda: a vote to expel me from the community for actions detrimental to the association. It was a ridiculous overreach, but she controlled the board, and she was desperate to make an example of me. But I had David Chen, my lawyer, on my side. He informed me that according to the HOA's own original charter, A vote for expulsion couldn't be done by the board alone. It required a special meeting of the entire membership, with a 2/3 majority vote. Karen had tried to find a loophole, but the founding rules were clear. This wasn't a fight she could win in a back room with her cronies. This had to happen in public, and that's exactly what I wanted. I formally requested the full member vote myself. The board had no choice but to schedule it. We booked the local high school auditorium for the following Tuesday night. For the next week, the neighborhood was electric with tension. Flyers appeared on mailboxes, some from Karen, filled with lies about me, and some from my friends, simply stating the date and time of the meeting and urging people to hear the full story. The night of the meeting, the auditorium was packed. I'd never seen more than 20 people at an HOA meeting before. Tonight, there were over 200. Nearly every household was represented. People were standing in the aisles. They weren't there for the drama. They were there because they finally felt like their voices might matter. Karen and her 2 board allies sat on the stage at a long table, looking self-important. I sat in the front row with Skip and David. The meeting started with Karen giving a long, rambling speech about rules, order, and the unfortunate necessity of removing a disruptive element from our peaceful community. She painted a picture of me as a dangerous renegade. When she finally finished, it was my turn. I didn't go to the podium with a speech. I just had a simple USB drive. I walked up to the stage, plugged it into the school's laptop, and the projector screen flickered to life behind Karen. The first image that appeared was a high-resolution photo of Karen's plush white bathrobe, draped over the captain's chair inside the Maggie D. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I didn't have to say much. The pictures spoke for themselves. One after another, I clicked through the slideshow. A close-up of the dirty coffee mug with the HOA logo on my galley counter. The half-empty bottle of cheap wine next to my navigation equipment. The pile of beer cans and cigarette butts Skip had found swept into a corner of the deck. I showed them the photo of the tampered wiring on my navigation system and the ripped-out solar panels. Then I put up the official invoice Karen had sent me for $1,200 for the emergency contamination cleanup. The crowd was silent now, leaning forward in their seats. Next, I displayed Skip's official surveyor's report, with the key findings highlighted in bright red. No evidence of fuel leak. Vessel abandonment claim unfounded. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, angrier. I let the evidence sink in. Then I said, my voice steady and clear. This was never about a fuel leak. This was never about an abandoned boat. This was about a president of our association who decided she wanted a free lake house, and she used her power, our power, to take it. I could see the panic in Karen's eyes. She started to stand up, to object, but David Chen was already walking to the microphone. And it gets worse, he said, his voice calm and professional. While Mrs. Schulman was enjoying her unauthorized vacation, she had some visitors. The next image on the screen was a grainy black and white photo, but it was perfectly clear. It was from a trail cam one of the other boat owners had set up to watch his own slip after a few things went missing. The photo showed Karen's son and 2 of his friends in the middle of the night, carrying my solar panels and a piece of my navigation equipment off the dock and toward the parking lot. These items were later found by police in Mrs. Schulman's garage, David continued. Theft charges against her son are pending. A collective gasp went through the auditorium. The room erupted. People were on their feet, yelling, pointing at the stage. Karen tried to say something, but her words were drowned out. She looked at her fellow board members for support, but they were already inching their chairs away from her, their faces pale. She saw there was no escape. She grabbed her purse and tried to storm off the stage, but the crowd wouldn't let her pass. The shouting was deafening. Finally, Jim, my neighbor, a man who rarely spoke above a whisper, got up on a chair and roared, "Vote!" The call was picked up by others. "Vote! Vote! Vote!" The noise was like thunder. A motion was made from the floor to remove not just Karen, but her 2 allies on the board, effective immediately. Hands shot up all over the auditorium. It was a sea of them. It wasn't even close. When the count was finished, the result was announced. 92% of the homeowners present voted for their immediate removal. A wave of cheers and applause washed over the room. It felt like a dam had broken. People were clapping, hugging, shaking my hand. It was more than just a vote. It was a revolution. It was the moment a whole community of quiet, decent people decided they'd had enough and took their power back. The fallout from that meeting was swift and absolute. Karen didn't go quietly into the night. For a few days, she spiraled. I got a handful of unhinged voicemails, rambling threats that just cemented how unstable she truly was. But her power was gone, and without it, she was just noise. The real work began with the new interim HOA board. With Karen and her cronies out, the remaining members, good people who had been sidelined and ignored, stepped up. Their first official act was to vote for a full independent audit of the HOA's finances going back 2 years. It was like turning over a rock. The auditors found a cesspool of bogus fines, questionable vendor contracts, and emergency fees, with no corresponding invoices. Jim's $500 paint fine was reversed. The $1,200 contamination fee she'd tried to stick me with was wiped from the books. Dozens of other homeowners who had been unfairly fined received letters of apology and full refunds. The money, it turned out, hadn't been stolen, just misallocated to fund Karen's little vanity projects, like hiring that rent-a-cop to patrol the neighborhood and installing the ridiculous keypad lock on the marina gate. Her resignation was formalized a week later. She didn't even show up to the meeting to sign the papers. She sent them by courier. And then, she just disappeared. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn. Within a month, she was gone. She vanished from public life as quickly as she had tried to dominate it. With the noise finally gone, I could focus on what mattered. I could finally bring the Maggie D home. It took me and Skip the better part of a week to undo the damage. We reinstalled new solar panels, rewired the navigation system, and replaced the batteries she had drained. I scrubbed every inch of the cabin, erasing every trace of her presence, until it finally smelled like salt and varnish and old memories again. The day my daughter called to tell me she'd been reinstated at her job, with a formal apology from her company's HR department, was the day I finally felt the weight lift. She told me the story of Karen's anonymous email had become something of a legend around her office, a cautionary tale about what happens when a petty tyrant messes with the wrong family. That weekend, for the first time in months, I took the boat out. It was early, just as the sun was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The engine hummed perfectly. As I guided the Maggie D out of the marina and onto the open water, I saw my neighbors, my friends, standing on the docks. They weren't there by accident. They had come to see me off. They waved, they raised their coffee cups in a silent toast. It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world. It was the feeling of community, restored. We had faced down a bully together, and we had won. The lake was calm, a sheet of mirrored glass. The air was clean and cold. It felt like the first day of the rest of my life. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The new HOA president was a retired firefighter named Bill, a man who spoke in calm, measured sentences and genuinely listened when people talked. The first thing he did was organize a community meeting to rewrite the bylaws. The abusive clauses Karen had slipped in were torn out. New rules were put in place to ensure transparency and prevent any single person from ever accumulating that much unchecked power again. Our marina co-op became a symbol of that new beginning. We opened membership to the entire community, not just the original group of vets. The fees were fair, and the money went directly back into maintaining the docks and facilities. Last summer, we started a new tradition: free sailing lessons for any local kid who wanted to learn. Watching them out on the water, their faces full of joy and excitement, felt like the perfect antidote to the ugliness that had come before. Before I put the boat away for the winter last year, I did one last thing. I had a small, bronze plate made. I installed it myself, on the deck, right next to the helm where Maggie used to stand, her hand on my shoulder, as we sailed. The engraving was simple. It just said, "For Maggie, still standing watch." The boat was more than just a boat again. It was a promise kept. It was a testament to the fact that when good people stand together, when they refuse to be intimidated by hollow authority, they can't be beaten. They can restore what was broken. They can take back their peace. And they can, finally, sail on.